Hello, it's Bruce Williams, and today I want to present part 5 of my series on the selected gross pathology of the musculoskeletal system, in which we're going to talk about nutritional or metabolic diseases that affect bones and muscles. As I do at the beginning of all of my lectures, I want to thank those friends and colleagues who provided me images either directly or through online collections, which allow me to put these lectures together. One of the most common lesions that we will see in bones in malnutrition is serious atrophy of fat. This is a direct result of deficient energy or protein intake and is also known as gelatinous bone marrow transformation or starvation marrow, in which the bone marrow is characterized by atrophy of adipocytes, loss of hematopoietic cells, and deposition in a hyaluronic acid-rich mucopolysaccharide matrix. It's not specific to the bone, and you can also see this in a number of other organs of the body, including around the heart and within the mesentery and omentum. But the bone marrow is not the only part of the bone that suffers in times of malnutrition. In young growing animals, you will often see growth arrest lines, deposited lines of bone which are parallel instead of perpendicular to the growth plate. Normal endochondral ossification occurs in a perpendicular fashion. And at the end of growth, the body stops growth by capping the epiphysis with a line of bone. In times of malnutrition, it does something very similar, and you can see these transversely arrayed lines of bone. And in the intervening area, the deposited primary spongiosa that's been remodeled is very sparse. So remember this, growth arrest lines in the metaphysis of animals undergoing malnutrition. And you'll see one line for each period of malnutrition. So this animal probably went through 2 different times of malnutrition before it completed its growth. In older animals in which the growth plates are closed, malnutrition or a lack of dietary protein or energy is manifested by osteopenia, a decreased production of bone, often with transverse bone bars, which help to stabilize these areas of severe lack of bone. Over time, if malnutrition goes on long enough and osteopenia is severe enough, you may see pathologic fractures, especially in the vertebra. The presence of a fracture over an area of osteopenia is known as osteoporosis. And these vertebral fractures, also known as butterfly fractures, because at least on this side you can see a wing, are very common in older human females who have severe osteopenia. Another method of developing osteopenia, one that I'm working on right now with my left ankle in a cast, is that of disuse. Bone needs pressure and various electromagnetic forces to maintain its normal consistency. And without that, or in times of disuse, there will be osteopenia that develops. Remember that radiographically you need to have at least 50% bone loss or more to see osteopenia. So chances are there's a lot that goes undiagnosed. Another way that you will develop osteopenia is by the production or use of excessive steroids. It can be seen in animals with hypercortisolemia or Cushing's disease, or in cases of idiopathic steroid use. Steroids, they inhibit osteoblastic differentiation, and they encourage osteoclastic bone resorption. So going back and putting it all together, this is a great lesion here for malnutrition in animals. Not disuse, not steroids, because we have marked loss of bone, and then we have the concomitant bone marrow atrophy, which is generally only seen in malnutrition or cachexia. Here's a very common lesion in older dogs. You can see it in young dogs. You can see it in any animal species which is suffering from prolonged hypocalcemia. Now, calcium is very important to the body. Obviously, it's a major important of bone and the hydroxyapatite crystal, but it's also extremely important in muscular contractions and many other physiologic activities, including the heartbeat. So you can't not have calcium there, but the bones provide a ready store of calcium in times of hypocalcemia. In most animal species, especially in older animals, chronic renal failure, end-stage kidney, is a common cause of hypocalcemia as a result of retention of phosphorus, concomitant lowering of the calcium level by the body, and stimulation of the parathyroid hormones. What they do is they increase osteoclastic resorption and the mobilization of calcium from the bone to be used by the body for other things. Additionally, parathyroid hormone reduces the expression of osteoprogesterone, which is an inhibitor of osteoclast maturation and activation, and also will cause the transformation of bone marrow stromal cells into fibroblasts to replace the bone that is being resorbed. This lesion is occasionally seen in young animals with inappropriate diets which have too high a level of phosphorus. But this particular form of fibrous osteodystrophy is most often seen in horses and called Bran disease, where the initial lesions are probably seen in the small bones of the legs, causing a subclinical lameness. Advanced cases will have profound swelling and replacement of the maxilla with fibrous connective tissue, causing a fleshing out of the face. And the disease is called Bran disease. It's a form of nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism because horses have the unique ability to take in as much phosphorus as they're given. They'll put a halt if you give them too much calcium, but they will take in all the phosphorus that you give them. And as a result, their normal dietary calcium phosphorus should be in a 1-to-1 ratio. But diets of 1 to 3 or more, animals that are being fed a lot of concentrates, that's where it gets its name Bran disease, may be predisposed to this particular condition. Fibrous osteodystrophy, fibrosis of the affected bones to mobilize calcium. This one's called Bran disease. Hypocalcemia in the young animal will result in rickets. Rickets affects the developing growth plates, and due to a lack of mineralization of the primary spongiosa, it doesn't get remodeled. So you get these large areas of flaring around the metaphysis of affected bones, in this case, the costochondral junction of the ribs. And when we cut through that, we will see at the growth plate, you'll see these large, well, the costochondral junction in this case, but the growth plate and long bones, you will see these long tongues of unremodeled primary spongiosa. It's not a constant level across the growth plate. It's sort of irregular, and that's just the nature of rickets and scurvy when we get into that, when you look at that. And the reason that this happens is because there is not enough calcium to mineralize the osteoid that's already been laid down by osteoblasts on the primary spongiosa. Sort of like salt. And osteoclasts like a little bit of salt on their food, and they are not going to touch the osteoid in the primary spongiosa and remodel it if there's not calcium. They don't like unmineralized matrix. Just another picture of that beautiful rachitic rosary, and one more picture of a very irregular growth plate. If you get to this one too late, you reestablish calcium levels, you're just not going to get it. Now, you can't really cause this by calcium, decreasing calcium or increasing phosphorus. This is generally considered, as is rickets and osteopenia or osteochondrosis, all names for the disease in adult animals, or osteomalacia. That's another one we don't hear about too much anymore. It is often the result of not enough activated vitamin D. The animals can be supplemented, but remember, you have to have it activated by ultraviolet light. So it can become the gatekeeper for calcium and bring calcium into the body through the intestine. And so we see rickets in animals, especially like veal calves, who are not exposed to sunlight and have deficient levels of activated vitamin D within their bodies. Now in poultry, you can get this as a result of rations that are deficient in calcium, phosphorus, or vitamin D3. This is a young chick. You can see that there's very little mineral in its beak. Don't do this in the live animal. That has got to hurt. And in adult animals, especially those in lay or actively laying eggs, they will often, if not heavily supplemented with calcium, will develop a condition known as layer fatigue or layer paralysis. It is clastic osteomalacia, and you see thickening and deviation of the keel bone, because that's what they lay on when they're laying eggs. So you have resorption of the bone, fibrous osteodystrophy, and a twisting of this bone. Remember that about 20% of the body's mineral reserves every day is used to put that mineralized casing on the egg. So these animals have to be heavy supplemented, and eventually will get to the point where not only their bones will be significantly deformed, as we see here, or look at these ribs. That's mostly fibrous connective tissue. But eventually they won't be able to move. They have so little calcium that they just cannot contract their muscles properly, resulting in a condition known as cage paralysis. Another species that will develop rickets, if not supplemented with vitamin D3, they can't use vitamin D2, are New World monkeys. Here's an adult monkey with severely deformed legs as a result of rickets. You're not going to remodel these changes away. Obviously, this animal was kept in poor conditions, probably by somebody who knew nothing about keeping monkeys. Look how cachectic this animal is. This is not a condition that we see in well-managed zoo collections, but it is a condition that we see in pet species, people that just give the animals what they want and know nothing about the dietary requirements. Remember, this is vitamin D3, and New World monkeys have to have D3, can't use D2. So they will develop rickets. Here's a cross-section through growth plate, and you can see these abnormally long tongues of unmineralized osteoid and bone deformity, which characterize rickets, also known as simian bone disease in young animals. It's still simian bone disease in older animals as well. A beautiful ricketic rosary. And one of the early signs that you see in simian bone disease in certain animal species, such as this capuchin in this beautiful picture by Dr. Sasmita Mishra, is tremendous resorption of the bone of the face, just like we saw in the horse and the dog, and wide spacing of the teeth. There's also gingival hemorrhage as a result of these teeth being very loose in that fibrous connective tissue matrix. Look at the tremendous pliability of this bone and how you can bend it. And a good way to tell rickets in, at least in production animals and calves or whatever, is normally you should not be able to break ribs. If you can break ribs with your bare hands, that animal is probably osteopenic. You just have to figure out why. The ribs in this monkey look very much like the ribs that we saw in that chicken with osteomalacia, just these multiple nodules of fibrous connective tissue replacing mineralized bone. My favorite picture from simian bone disease is one I often show residents. Nobody ever gets it. And you can see here that there's something wrong. The bone is discolored, but it's also the cranium is much thicker than normal. And a lot of the bone's been replaced by fibrous connective tissue, and you can see the vasculature in fibrous connective tissue, which you normally wouldn't see in mineralized bone. Another case of simian bone disease. One more species that gets a metabolic form of bone disease, fibrous osteodystrophy, affecting all of the bones, including the bones of the legs. And here the the two sides, especially of the mandible, is iguanas, especially green iguanas. And they develop, it's called metabolic bone disease in green iguana, but it's just fibrous osteodystrophy as a result of a resorption of bone to supply calcium to important metabolic processes. And you can do this by giving the animal just leafy greens. Once again, poor owners often do this. But even in well-supplemented animals, if they do not receive a specific wavelength of UVB light, which is necessary to activate their vitamin D and bring calcium across the intestinal barrier into the bloodstream, they will develop this even in well-formulated diets. So iguanas need special forms of UVB light. Here's a long bone in an iguana, and you can see the marked thickening of the cortex, replacement by fibrous connective tissue, even cavitation at one end. Another vitamin that's incredibly important in the proper formation and maintenance of the musculoskeletal system is vitamin C. It is important in many different organ systems, but in the musculoskeletal system, it is seen in a particular number of species which lack L-guanylactone, the enzyme which allows most species to produce vitamin C. Primates, fish, guinea pigs, people who are primates, and certain species of fruit bats and birds do not have that enzyme. Dogs, pigs, cows, horses, cats, they can all make vitamin C so they don't get the deficiency. And this is a great way to tell this grossly from rickets in the absence of hemorrhage is because only certain species will get the lesions. The gross lesions are very similar to what we see in animals with rickets, but only a few species are affected. Vitamin C is the essential cofactor for lysyl and proline hydroxylase, which are important in the proper cross-linking of of collagen type 1 and collagen type 4. Collagen type 4 is the collagens found in basement membranes of blood vessels. So these animals often will have hemorrhage in the areas of friction, areas of motion, and it's often a dead giveaway grossly for scurvy, especially here. Type 1 collagen is found in teeth and found in bones and is very important. These animals are painful. They don't want to move. And in young growing animals, the lesions grossly very similar to rickets, with the exception that it's often associated with hemorrhage in scurvy. And you get the abnormal long tongues of cartilage within the growth plates of animals with scurvy. Very difficult to tell the difference. The mechanism is that the osteoid that is laid down is improperly cross-linked and cannot be mineralized. So osteoclasts don't care about it. So that's the difference between rickets, basically, on a mechanistic basis. Scurvy has unmineralized osteoid because it has deficient type 1 collagen and can't accept the mineral. Rickets, the osteoid of the growth plate is unmineralized because there's not enough mineral around to mineralize it. Here's another picture of a non-human primate with some flaring and damage at the distal radius and ulna and the hemorrhage that should make you think about scurvy. It's those weak vessels with improper type 4 collagen. In the mouth, you'll have hemorrhage. The teeth will be somewhat mottled. This was the initial presenting sign in scurvy in humans with people who spend a lot of time on boats with no source of vitamin C. There's hemorrhage. The teeth are somewhat movable, but you don't have that tremendous proliferation of fibrous connective tissue and fibrous osteodystrophy that you do in rickets. Squirrel monkeys have a very interesting lesion associated with vitamin C deficiency where they develop these rather large hematomas on top of their head. I don't know why it's on top of their head. Maybe they whack each other on the head when nobody's looking. But they would get these large hematomas due to the defective blood vessels. And over time, when you would reestablish their normal vitamin C levels, some of these would ossify. So it would be a lifelong reminder of a temporary deficiency of vitamin C. Remember, vitamin C in in food tends to be very heat labile and is also the first one to go as the feed gets older. So it might not always be a poor formulation. It might be poor storage technique. In a lot of lectures, we've talked about vitamin E deficiency. We will talk about in the cardiovascular lectures. We've talked about it in most species and its effect on many different organs, including both striated and cardiac muscle. And we'll focus on skeletal muscle here. It is the vitamin E deficiency is generally the result of the body's exhaustion of vitamin E and maybe some other cofactors or some other minerals which are potent antioxidants like selenium. And the body keeps lots of stores of vitamin E around in order to combat the free radicals that are produced by dietary unsaturated fatty acids. And those unsaturated fatty acids get into the body and they are very damaging. They produce free radicals which will cause damage to the cell membrane and the organelle membrane within striated muscle. It can be, in young animals, it can be large areas and very devastating, giving rise to the name white muscle disease. And it affects the heart. It is often life-threatening. In older animals, animals that are on poor diets with lots of unsaturated fatty acids, or maybe animals with chronic diarrhea, which prevent them from absorbing the vitamin E, it may manifest as large areas of white muscle, which is the result of myofiber degeneration, necrosis, and mineralization, or simple severe atrophy and fibrosis. And I often see it in old animals in a range of skeletal muscle, probably just to old age and maybe a poor diet. And those will be little speckled areas of necrosis and mineralization, probably don't add up too much. So this is white muscle disease, and yes, it affects skeletal muscle. We'll see very similar lesions in our next lecture on toxic damage to skeletal muscle. And this is a streak of necrotic muscle and other little patches in a very old dog with chronic diarrhea. Vitamin A is a very interesting vitamin with its effects on skeletal muscle. And what it does depends on whether the animal is young or old and various species. One of the classic lesions associated with hypervitaminosis A in animals are probably eating a lot of liver where it is stored. So these animals are on awful diets, not AWFUL, although they are awful, but OFFAL. And one of the classic lesions is seen in the cervical vertebra of cats. And in adult cats, high levels of vitamin A cause a stimulation and proliferation of chondrocytes and osteoblasts and excessive laying down of bone in areas of motion and articulation. And you can see here the bone is always laid down where two bones come together, where there is movement, and it is thought the reason that you see so much proliferation in the area of the cervical vertebra is that area gets a lot more motion than in other species because cats are always bathing themselves and moving that head around. In young animals, in kittens, it has the exact opposite and causes necrosis of chondrocytes and osteoblasts and premature closure of the physis. Another great lesion that is seen in cats and other species, including cattle, is the effect of hypo or low levels of vitaminosis on remodeling of the bones of the skull. This was first identified in 1975. There's a great picture from Dr. J. Kohler showing flattening of the cerebellum and cerebellar coning because this lion cub was given too little vitamin A, and it resulted in deficient osteoclast activation, and the bones of the skull got too thick and there wasn't enough room for the brain. A similar lesion is seen with thick bones of the cranium in calves, which are deficient in vitamin A, but that lesion is seen in the area of the optic foramina, and it actually pinches the optic nerve, causing optic nerve atrophy and blindness. Similar clinical sign, similar mechanism, but a different location. Well, that covers the vitamin-related diseases of bone. Let's look at a couple of inborn errors of metabolism and finish this lecture up. These bones look pretty good from a cat, but they're the wrong color. They're reddish brown because they have increased amounts of a pigment called porphyrin within them. And this is a disease, congenital erythrocytic porphyrias disease, that affects cattle, both of which will also have mild hemolysis, and pigs. And the bones will be discolored due to accumulation of porphyrin. The urine will be discolored as a result of excess porphyrins being excreted, as in the form of protoporphyria. And this is due to the deficiency or defect in one of a number of genes, including ferrochelatase. The genes that are affected result in the formation of heme and the incorporation of iron into the heme molecule. And these deficiencies result in mild hemolytic anemia and circulation of large amounts of immature heme molecules, which are the porphyrins, and a well-known pigment in case you've done any work with laboratory rats, or you might have a white Maltese or poodle at home, and that's the reddish pigment that stains the hair around the eyes or the mouth. Here is a bone from a affected ox. It might be a Hereford or a Holstein or a Shorthorn or an Ayrshire. It's been reported in all of them, and you can see the discoloration of the kidney. It's just an abnormal pigmentation. There's really nothing going on histologically with these bones. They're totally normal histologically. Here's a case in the pig, and this is the one that the genetic mutation has not really been identified. Pigs don't have hemolysis, but they certainly do get the pigmentation of the bones and the teeth. And you can see in this calf there is pigmentation of the teeth, and the one easy way to diagnose this, besides the pigmentation, is when you put these bones or teeth under a woods lamp. They fluoresce like crazy because that pigment is excited by UV light. It causes a problem in cattle that are affected because they go out in the sunlight, and the high levels of porphyrins in the skin, in the blood vessels of the skin, will cause skin damage and necrosis, known as type 2 photosensitization. A single picture is probably worth an entire lecture, but I'm going to do that another day, is the cranial deformities, the bossing, the foreshortened jaws of this kitten with lysosomal storage disease. In this particular case, alpha manocytosis. Lysosomal storage diseases cause defects in which the loss of one enzyme, which normally breaks down waste products, will result in accumulation of this waste product within the cell, ultimately resulting in cellular degeneration and maybe death. And because so many of these lysosomal storage disorders affect the cells of the mesenchymal lineage, these cells are important in the remodeling of the skeleton, so skeletal abnormalities are not uncommon in animals with lysosomal storage diseases. Kittens with mucopolysaccharidosis 1 and 6 will also have them, and a number of other lysosomal storage diseases result in skeletal abnormalities. Let's finish up with one classic disease which affects the joints of both bird species and reptiles, and that's articular gout. It's not usually associated with dehydration like we see with visceral gout. Probably a combination of high protein diets and certain genetic lines result in the deposition of uric acid and result in granulomatous inflammation in the joints of a number of bird species and reptile species, including this tortoise as seen here. Well, that covers a lot of general concepts involving nutritional disease of the musculoskeletal system in various animal species. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope that you will come back to the Foundation's Facebook page, its YouTube channel, the Joint Pathology Center's video library for more lectures on the musculoskeletal system. Have a great day.